Just for those of you that don't know me, my name is Kim Karn. I am the former co-chair and the acting co-chair of the Nashoba SEPAC. The SEPAC is the Special Education Parent Advisory Council for the Nashoba School District. We do workshops on a monthly basis, and some of them are more niche in terms of focused on a special education audience, while others are focused on a broader audience, including neurotypical peers like this presentation. So we're lucky to have a great speaker here today. Dr. Angela Currie is here to speak to us about anxiety. Dr. Currie is a pediatric neuropsychologist at NESCA in Londonderry, New Hampshire, as well as Newton, Mass., where she conducts neuropsychological and psychological evaluations. She enjoys working with stressed out children and teens, working to tease apart the various factors that may be lending to their stress, such as underlying learning, attentional, or emotional challenges. Dr. Currie particularly enjoys working with the seemingly unmotivated child, as well as children who have flown under the radar for years due to their desire to succeed. So prior to introducing Dr. Currie, I just wanted to mention a few things about today's presentation specifically. As I mentioned, Stow TV is here to broadcast the presentation. Because of that, what we're going to ask is that we do the entire presentation first, and then I will have Stow TV end their broadcast. Once the broadcast has ended, I'll open it up to parent questions. That way, I know in question and answer in general, I always prompt you guys not to say your child's name when asking a question, but that way, in the spirit of anonymity, if someone does slip up and say their child's name, it's a parent audience only, and it's not being broadcast. Let me see if there's anything else here. Sorry. Oh yeah, lastly, we have a survey that's available online right now. So the Nashoba SEPAC has designed a needs assessment for our district. It was sent out to parents of children on IEPs and 504s, and it asks a variety of questions about the programming in the district, the services in the district, what you see as successful, what you see as opportunities. The survey actually closes tomorrow. So I just wanted to say a final push for it tonight. If you do have time, please, it takes like 15 minutes. Go in and populate the survey with your feedback. That way we will be able to present actually the feedback from the survey to the school committee on June 5th. So anything that you wanted to say, anything that you feel needs to be heard, that's your opportunity to do so. If you haven't gotten the survey and you feel like you should have gotten the survey, feel free to come and find me. And I can send it to you this evening. And I think that that's it. There is a sign-in sheet, and there's a one-pager over on that entry table. So if you didn't pick one up, Dr. Currie created those for this evening's event. So please feel free to pick one up. And without further ado, Dr. Angela Currie will be presenting to you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here tonight. It's a topic that I love to talk about. It's a topic that I basically work with every single day. And as a neuropsychologist, I'm most often thinking about stress and anxiety as it relates to things like learning and sort of functional performance in school or in social life. But the reality is that the things that we're going to talk about, as mentioned, apply to everybody, not just kids, parents, teachers, everyone. So these are things that are, yes, important for us to be thinking about when we're considering kids who might be presenting for a neuropsychological evaluation, because there's concerns about some aspect of their development, but the reality is that this is stuff that we really should care about for everybody. And it's stuff that we're seeing at increasing rates in our kids and in our society as a whole. And so what we're going to try to do today is talk a bit about, well, why is that? Like, why are we seeing more stress and anxiety? What's the difference between those things? But then, how does it impact kids? I mean, we know that we should care that there's more stress and anxiety, but we're going to try to sort of tease a little bit more about why and how it impacts from sort of a neurological level, the way that the brain's functioning, and then talk a little bit about what we can do to help. It's a lot to cover in one night. I do entire 6-hour trainings on this same exact topic, so we'll get through this stuff as best as we can, and as said, there'll be a chance for questions at the end. Like I said, we'll address, what's the difference with stress and anxiety? What does anxiety look like? It's not always the stereotypical presentation that we tend to think of. How does it function, and what does it connect with in the brain? And particularly with attention and executive function, and we'll define what that means as well. Motivation is one of my favorite things to talk about because I think it's a construct that's really misunderstood. And that really can be understood quite well through the lens of the information that we're talking about tonight. And like I said, general strategies that you can do preventatively with all kids, as well as things to do once you have a child who you're already concerned about their levels of stress and anxiety. Okay, so as I said, we have increased rates of stress and anxiety in society. It's not that we just think that we're seeing this. There's actual data to show that it's true. So some of the most recent estimates show the rates of ever having been diagnosed with either anxiety or depression, sort of in this sort of school age through high school age individuals. In 2003, about 5.4, up to 8%, up to 8% in 2007, and most recent epidemiological data that we have at 8.4 in 2011 or 12. I imagine if we had more recent data that would probably be even higher at this point. What's really important to emphasize is that these are individuals who have been diagnosed. So that means they've presented for treatment or evaluation or something, right, where they've actually been given a diagnosis. So this grossly underestimates the actual prevalence because most individuals are not presenting for treatment and they're not being given that official diagnosis. So the fact that it's showing that we're at probably around almost 10% at this point, I would imagine it's probably at least double that, if not triple, for individuals who actually could be diagnosed at some point, which gives us this lifetime prevalence. So this means that a given individual, their likelihood of being diagnosed with one of these conditions at some point in their life, we are closer to about a third of the population. More prevalent in girls, and there's a lot of research to show that teens today, they're feeling isolated, misunderstood, worried, dissatisfied, and their sense of self-control and their ability to make decisions in their life is much lower than it used to be. And I think it's really important to emphasize this issue of isolation. In a culture where we are constantly connected online, we're actually feeling the most isolated than we've ever felt before, really emphasizing that sort of false sense of connection that's created through things like social media, which probably starts to get into some of the reasons as to why we're seeing these increased rates. And we can only guess. Any research that may be there would be entirely correlational. But the most common themes that come up when we start to think about why there might be these increases. One is that kids have way less time for free play than they did in the past. When I was a kid, I was a latchkey kid, and my parents would go to work, and in the summer we would go out and play, and we had friends in the neighborhood, neighbors checked on us and stuff, but we had a lot of time to just free play and explore outside and, go through the woods, and I only fell in a mine shaft one time, which is true. I needed a tetanus shot. But I survived, right? We're fine. We had those experiences. But think about all the things that happen in just even more basic free play, not even necessarily, outside exploring the outdoors, but when we have less structured time. Think about the risk-taking that kids are learning to do, or having to work together and compromise and communicate and sort of be imaginative. And that's stuff that we've really lost a lot of. Nowadays we have structured play times, our schedules are packed full, there's not a lot of downtime. Don't even start me on the term play date. I always swore before I had kids I would never use the term play date because it just sounds so structured. Why do we have to schedule play? But course, I find myself using it all the time now that I have children. But it's a problem that we don't have that time to learn how to take risks and be brave. There's a lot more focus on the extrinsic goals of life rather than the intrinsic, which, think about things like testing and evaluation. Now, I recognize the irony of being an evaluator and saying that we are evaluating too much, but it's true. I think we're in a sort of outcomes emphasized, particularly in terms of our educational system. That's a good thing. We want to do progress monitoring and we want to look at outcomes. But is there a point where it becomes too much for young children to be able to understand and manage? Reduced sense of control over life, as I mentioned before. Families are more stressed in general. So if we are more stressed as adults, then it's going to trickle down to our kids. Social media and technology access, this is, I think, probably a very big one, particularly for our adolescents. It used to be that at the end of the day, you could go in your room and shut the door and, you were alone. You shut the world out, for that time, which was sometimes a good thing. And now you can never do that if you are online. There's this constant stream of information and comparison that's too much for anybody to handle, really, but particularly for kids and adolescents who have not learned how to create those personal boundaries for themselves and sort of have that greater understanding of that, this is not a representation of actual life. And then the feed of news and media through those things as well. It's a big contributing factor that there's really no downtime. And the lack of care. So as I said before, those estimates of the rates of anxiety and depression are probably underestimates because the reality is that about 18% of individuals who have a diagnosis are accessing treatment. So if you have a diagnosis and still only 18% are accessing treatment, think about the number of people who aren't accessing treatment at all. It's a big problem. We can get into whole things about stigma, lack of care, managed care, all that stuff. But, when you put all this together, you can see why we might be experiencing higher levels of stress. And there's a lot of other explanations too as well, I'm sure. One of which that I like to make sure we emphasize is this issue of overscheduling. One of my favorite questions to ask when I'm doing an intake for a child is, so what does life look like after school? What's the schedule look like? Trying to get a sense of, how many transitions in the day is there for this child? How many activities? Where are they eating dinner? Where are they doing their homework? Is it in the car? Is it at home? What time are they getting to bed at night? My oldest child is 6, so he's just finishing kindergarten, and he has this athletic ability that I'm not really sure where it comes from, and it's the thing that he shines at, and it's baseball season, and it's the first year that, as a 6-year-old, he has practiced 2 nights a week from 5:45 to 7:15, and then games on the weekends. And to me, for a child who needs to be in bed at 7 o'clock, it's utterly ridiculous. But then there's this reality of, well, if it's the one thing that fuels his self-esteem the most, how do you say no, right? How do you say no to this child? And destroy sort of everything that they are invested in at 6 years old. This is everything to him. So, there's a realistic, constraints coming from our society. Why is it necessary for 6-year-olds to do baseball 3 times a week? I mean, it's just a little bit crazy. But we're sort of forced into it, and then it just becomes fueled. And what we know is that, teenagers, about 59% are reporting stress, related to balancing extracurricular activities. By the way, extracurricular activities are supposed to be fun and fulfilling, not stressful, and over half feel stressed by them. And the biggest problem is the impact on sleep. So as a whole, individuals are getting, about 2 hours of less sleep than they actually should be, getting. So we all know if we don't feel rested, we're not at our best. And it's only going to sort of make them less available to being able to regulate the stresses that they're experiencing and the complications of life and learning and social activities. So this one, I think, is a really big one, particularly for the kids who are presenting for evaluations, because we are at that point probably looking at things like learning concerns, and we have to really consider, what are some of the factors that might be interfering with their learning efficiency, their availability for processing information, and oftentimes that comes down to sleep. Okay, so stress versus anxiety, they're often interchangeably used, but the reality is that there is a difference. And I think that the difference here is really important when we think about the impact that these constructs are having on the way that we process and learn. And the biggest factor here is that stress is really a thing that is in the moment with a real life stressor that's happening right now. So it's related to present conditions, to something that's currently going on, but also it can be good. So there's eustress, which is the good stress, and then there's distress, which is the not so good stress. And I think that this is something that we have to really teach kids. I think we tend to give stress a bad rap. But the reality is if that we didn't ever feel stressed out, we wouldn't show up to work or prepare for things, or I wouldn't have prepared anything for the presentation tonight. I'd just show up with nothing to talk about. Stress is a good thing. It's what tells us that something is important and allows us to sort of get our resources together and motivate ourselves to prepare for it, and therefore perform maybe at our best. But then there's a line, right, where it becomes not helpful anymore, right? It's a little bit of a slippery slope, which we'll look at on another slide. Anxiety is where we start to get into not present conditions, right? So it may be a similar type of a trigger. So you could have stress about a test, and it was a really tough test, and you studied, but you didn't quite understand the information, and so therefore when you're taking the test, you're really stressed out about it, but you get through, and at the end of it, you kind of are able to let that go and you move on, right? Perfectly appropriate stress. The next time a test comes up, maybe you've mastered the information, it's actually not that hard of a test. Are you able to approach it in that way that you have confidence, you feel good about it? Or are you now picking up on the stress that you felt the last time you took a test? And now you're starting to apply it to this condition where there isn't an actual trigger there. You know everything, but you're carrying over your past experience into the present, right? So now we're focusing not on what's actually going on right now, but maybe what went on in the past, or perhaps what might happen in the future. So if I felt stressed in this test, I'm absolutely going to feel stress in every single other test that I take, right? So it's really removing yourself out of the present conditions and focusing either on the past or on the future. And there's certainly individuals who just have an overall sort of sense of elevated anxious arousal without a specific trigger in the moment, or in the past or in the future. But the idea here is that there's sort of misplaced angst, shall we say. It doesn't have anything to do with what's actually going on in the moment, at least not to the extent that we are thinking that we should feel that arousal. Like I said before, the stress issue is a bit of a slippery slope, because there's sort of this, oh, hold on, I used my pointer here. So if we didn't feel any stress at all, right, if we didn't care, our performance is going to be super low, right, because you probably won't even show up. So you have to start to feel some amount of stress, and then your performance starts to get optimized. And this is ideal little sweet spot of stress, right, where it really optimizes our performance. We know to care enough that we prepare ourselves, but then this is the slippery slope, right? Once we sort of get past that ideal spot, it's really easy to become so stressed out that you can't even really focus on the test or whatever it is that you're doing, and you start to forget the information or misread the questions, or, if I'm standing up here, I might forget what the information that's on my slide, and I have to take extra time to kind of pull my thoughts together, right? So this is the slope that leads to anxiety later on, right? Because now the stress is starting to interfere with your performance, and we're no longer seeing the stress as being helpful or beneficial. But this is something that nobody tells us. But for some reason, we don't teach about healthy stress. And so as soon as a child who doesn't understand these emotional concepts, as soon as they start to worry about something, they don't know what to do with that. It doesn't feel good per se. So they start to think that it's bad. Right from the get-go, they think that it's a bad thing. And they start to mislabel this potentially really useful emotional experience that they're having. Right? So right from the beginning, we start to approach stress as a bad thing, as opposed to understanding that it's actually useful when we know how to use it, but nobody ever really teaches us how to do that, how to use the skill of stress. So this is something that's actually pretty simple. We could make this a little bit more simplistic than a bell curve if we were trying to teach it to a young child, but it's something that we kind of forget to do. Okay, so to go into anxiety a little bit more as a construct and defining it, because I think it's important to understand the function of anxiety in order to know how to identify it in a child or anybody, but we're all here to talk about our children. So there's a reason we have it. We wouldn't have it if it wasn't helpful. From an evolutionary perspective, right, it got our bodies geared up and ready to go, and we had a threat at hand, right? So in cave times, even if there wasn't I don't know, whatever that is, some kind of prehistoric warthog chasing us in this moment, it was really important to remember that last week when I went to this area, there was a prehistoric warthog that chased me and almost killed me. And so even though I'm not seeing it right now, I should probably avoid this area, right? That's kind of anxiety, right? Because it's thinking about past conditions, not the present ones per se, and it's reinforcing avoidance. And avoidance is a big factor in anxiety, right? It's that fear of approaching something that is difficult. But from an evolutionary perspective, that was totally adaptive. There's a reason why our bodies and our brains have been trained to have this response. It's just a problem when it becomes kind of applied to a situation that doesn't actually have that level of threat, right? There's very few things in day-to-day life for most people, not everybody, but for most people, where there's a constant presence of a life-threatening situation, right? For most people, not everybody. But our body still has, and our brain still have that potential reaction, right? So we have to try to figure out what to do with it for the individuals who, particularly those who are sort of predisposed to have those experiences, perhaps from a genetic perspective. And when we are having that anxious response, there's sort of two most standard, shall we say, responses tend to be the fight or the flight response. And then there's sort of this third option of the freeze response. And I'll explain why that's sort of a third option as opposed to a reaction that we were meant to have. The fighter, I think we all know the fighter, that anxious fighter. So these are the kids who, when you present them with a demand that is a little bit anxiety-provoking for them, they just, flat out refuse to do it. Argumentative, not compliant at all. Maybe, there's certainly not everybody's in the extremes, but I've had plenty of kids in my office when I've asked them to do a particular academic task that they've taken it and literally ripped it in half or thrown it across the room. Right? I mean, that right there is a very extreme fight response. Right? That's not necessarily always, it's not always at that level, but, these are the kids who are impulsive, and you can just see that they have this strong kind of guttural reaction to the thing that's making them experience that emotion. Now, one challenge is that these kids are really often misunderstood because it looks like they are just oppositional, and I think we're all smart enough to know that that's not a real thing, right? Like, nobody's just oppositional. That doesn't exist. If you didn't know that now. Nobody is just oppositional, right? If a kid could do a thing that you were asking them to do, they would do it, right? But that's not necessarily, it's not our first reaction when we have a kid who's persistently being oppositional or difficult to deal with. It's not our inclination to think, maybe they have anxiety, right? That's not necessarily where we go. In spite of the fact that we most often misunderstand these kids initially, they're the kids that I worry the least about. I don't necessarily worry about these kids. And the reason is because nobody misses the fighter. We all know the fighter, right? The fighter does not fly under the radar, right? Yes, maybe we're misinterpreting them at first, but at least we flag them, right? Like, at least we know they need help, and hopefully we eventually kind of get down to the matter for them, but they get help fastest as opposed to our other presentations. So these are the kids that are challenging to work with, perhaps, or to parent. I have one of these. So I speak from personal experience. But they get help. Unlike, perhaps, sometimes, our flighter. Now, this could be the child who, literally runs out of the room when you ask them to do something that's difficult. They could literally flee, perhaps. But more likely, they're sort of the skillfully avoidant child who can think of 1,000 reasons as to why they need to sharpen their pencil or go to the bathroom or walk the dog instead of doing their homework because that's their chore and they don't want to not do their chores. So they're going to do every other chore before they have to do their reading assignment, right? So these are the sort of persistently distractible, Rico Suave when it comes to all these different reasons as to why they're just helping people, but at the end of the day, they're really just not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And they also may just give up easily, right? So maybe they strive and then they just I can't do this, right? So they sort of psychologically escape from the task that they're trying to do. So again, this is a child who may just look like they have attention problems. And so we might just think, well, they just can't pay attention and that's not why they're not doing it. Or, they, 1,000 different things. Sometimes we're even thinking that this could be a legitimate, a health issue or whatever, because they are just tired, or they're not getting enough sleep, or they're hungry, or whatever it is. It's keeping them from being able to sort of stick with something and have that stamina. And so this kid can look like a lot of other different possibilities. And these are all kids who we often think that they're just making the choice to not do it, too. They're the unmotivated child, shall we say, and I'll talk a lot about that. But again, we may not necessarily think that this is a kid who has stress or anxiety. Okay, and then the freeze. So from an evolutionary standpoint, we can all see a lot of benefit to being the fighter, right? So prehistoric, whatever we called it, came up and, I'm going to eat you. So you can either fight it, right, and try to take control, or you can get out, right? Those were your options. Freezing and playing dead or something, that's not from an evolutionary perspective an adaptive response, right? This is not a healthy response if your goal is survival, right? So what this is, it's more of a trauma response. So this is the response that we see in kids who have persistently been confronted with a task that they can't do, and it's anxiety provoking or whatever, and they can't do it, and they now sort of develop that deer in the headlights sort of reaction where they have just learned that this is something they have no control over. They have no ability to kind of think about the skills that they need or the ways to get around it or how to ask for help, and they just get stuck, right? So this is again, persistent experience of failure within a given task. And that doesn't mean just like an academic task, any type of task. This could be a social situation, it could be anything, right? So this is a kid who has already had the experience of the inability to do something. And so now when it comes up, there's, why fight? Why try to run away? Like nothing is going to work, right? So they just get frozen. So these are individuals who might have a hard time initiating, the task where they're just sitting there and like staring at the book. And you walk by 10 minutes later and they're still just sitting there staring at the first line of the book. They may have a hard time kind of shifting out. Like they get so hyper-focused on trying to fix this one thing that they cannot get away from it. They can't let it go. They're trying to exert an excessive amount of efforts to control the situation to get it perfectly, that they have no ability to then sort of see beyond this one tiny piece of it, and so they get stuck there. So you get stuck in the beginning, you can get stuck in the middle, or you can get stuck at the end, where it's, they maybe have now gotten sort of towards an end point, but being able to let go of it and kind of call it final can be really hard. So these are individuals who probably fly under the radar the most because oftentimes they look like they're doing good work. Right? Oh, they're putting so much effort in. They want to do their best. But at the end of the day, maybe they're putting 4 hours of work into something that should only take an hour and a half. So it's not necessarily good, efficient effort. It's excessive effort. So, then these are people who also had those prior experiences of failure. And which means that they're probably also not the ones who are asking for help because the problem's not yet being identified. So, obviously a big concern, particularly when we look at it from sort of an educational perspective. We're looking at kids who perhaps have been confronting learning issues or for quite some time that they've managed to overcompensate, with their excessive efforts, but at the cost of their emotional health. The problem is that the more that we practice anything, the better we get at it, and that includes things that we really shouldn't be practicing. So the more that we practice being stressed and anxious, the better we are at it, right? So the more that we have the experience of confronting an anxiety-provoking situation and getting stuck in it, or feeling like we have to run away from it in order to manage the emotional experience, the more likely we are to have that reaction again the next time. So if we try to avoid a situation, we have a homework assignment and it's anxiety-provoking, so we decide just to not do it. Hey, we didn't have to be anxious, so that worked, right? So next time, we're going to be even more likely to have that anxious response because it worked, right? Because the goal in that moment was not to do the homework. The goal was to not have anxiety. And then the more that we have those experiences of having anxiety, then find these maladaptive ways of trying to manage it, the more likely we are to be anxious and use a maladaptive strategy subsequent situations. So it's a problem because and that's not just from a behavioral perspective, it's from a brain-based perspective as well. Like literally the neurological networks that are causing the anxiety to happen become more efficient over time. They fire faster. And we have less opportunity, that like small space of opportunity between sort of a trigger and when you have that reaction, it's that moment of being able to apply a skill or a strategy. That moment gets shorter and shorter and shorter the more that we rehearse it because the brain is firing faster and faster the more that we practice the scenario. Which means that these people who are experiencing anxiety, they're not only having those reactions faster, but they're going to be more likely to be on the lookout for the stimuli in their environment that's going to signal to them that there is a threat, right? So they start to be on the lookout for it because knowing that it's going to happen quickly, so I better be on the lookout. And in the meantime, they're not paying attention to like all that other stuff that they should be paying attention to in the moment. So that might be in a social situation. They may not be really listening to what people are saying or picking up on those nonverbal cues that help them to really understand the meaning of what's going on and how to act or behave. And Therefore, they're probably more likely to cause the trigger to happen, right? So if they're on the lookout for saying something the wrong way and then others judging them because they said it the wrong way, if they're not paying attention to what's going on, they're probably more likely to make that social blunder, right? So not only are they now more reactive to the situations, but you're probably engaging in the behaviors that are going to cause those situations to happen because you're on the lookout. It's just this like really evil anxiety cycle. Do you guys feel stressed yet? Right? I mean, it's just stressful to think about, like, how quickly these things become trained in our brain. And we have to find those opportunities to sort of slow down that response in that cycle, because otherwise it really is this recursive pattern that's sort of self-reinforcing. And not only that, it's not only sort of having an impact on our emotional reactions in the moment, but on a lot of other sort of brain-based functions that are really important for like every aspect of life. And from a neuropsychological perspective, the things that we tend to focus in on are, so we're sort of talking about your emotional control, right? And the things that it intersects with most are, executive function, which we'll talk about what that is. But it's sort of the thinking skills that make us better than apes. And then attentional control, right? So we all know that when we are stressed out, we aren't paying attention to the right things, and we might be more likely to be like impulsive, right? So if we're late for a meeting and we're on the highway and we're driving, and there's tons of traffic and you're going to be late, you might start to cut people off, or do things that are impulsive, like swear at another driver perhaps, or you're not paying attention, you miss your exit, right? We all know that when we're anxious, we are not behaving and thinking the way that we normally do. And it's because of this dynamic, this lovely toxic triad, as I love to term it. And so this here is what really helps us to understand the impact of this elevated stress and anxiety levels, and how it's impacting the way that kids are learning and engaging in interactions and relationships. So to break it down a bit more, so executive function, I think this term is talked about more nowadays than it was even 5-10 years ago. But it's a complex set of cognitive and behavioral skills. And what it really is responsible for is helping us to sort of do goal-driven behavior, right? Having a goal that's in the future and knowing what we need to do in order to get there in an efficient and well-organized manner. I think the best way to think about this is that it has nothing to do with how smart a person is. You can have the smartest person in the world who is completely disorganized and all over the place, right? It has nothing to do with intellect. It has everything to do with efficiency. So you may have two individuals who have the same exact goal, right? So maybe they are told, like, here is a writing assignment that they have to do. And student A automatically knows, okay, it's due on that date, which means I need to have my first draft done by this date. I'm going to pick my topic, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go to the library, I'm going to find 3 books, and from those 3 books, I'm going to create my citations, and blah, 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 right? And they have a plan, and they see a direct route for task completion, and they do it, right? So the sky is clear, they can see the end, there's like no clutter in the way, they just get it done, and they get it done in the fastest way possible. Okay, good for student A. Student B, poor student B, right? It's still there, right? The end point is there, but they can't see it, right? They don't know which way to go. They can't see how long it's going to take, how long the road is. There's all this like interference along the way, right? So it's really kind of muddy, and because of it, they don't even know where to start because it's just so overwhelming, right? So both of these students can get to the end point and have a paper of the same quality and the same grade, but one got there really efficiently, and the other one was probably a nightmare for them, right? procrastination, confusion, meltdowns, crying, right? So that's executive function, right? It's not about what the end point is. It's about how you get there. So it's like I was saying, the sort of the set of cognitive and sort of regulatory skills that allow you to do this sort of goal-directed behavior. So there's a lot of different ways you can break down executive function. It just depends which book you pick up. We're going to make it overly simplified and think about sort of two larger domains within it. One being sort of your metacognitive, which you can think of sort of like task, your management of your thoughts and the task at hand. And then there's sort of like behavioral regulation, like management of yourself. So the metacognitive, these are things, and this is a lot of this stuff that's in here, but there's more. I mean, these are really large domains. Organization of a lot of stuff, your ideas, your materials, your time, being able to sort of hold information in your head as you're hearing it. So working memory, so that ability to sit in class, hear what a teacher is saying, hold it, connect it with prior experiences, or maybe write it down on a piece of paper and not miss the next thing that they said, right? Really appreciating and understanding what a task is asking you to do, that's a skill. Making a plan, initiating work, sustaining effort, monitoring performance, thinking flexibly, and being able to change your approach, right? I mean, and again, we could go on. There's a lot of other things. I think that I like to throw self-advocacy in here. Even though it's not technically a metacognitive skill, it's kind of a result, perhaps, or it's a way of it's a combination of a lot of these skills when they come together. And the reason why I throw it up there is because I've seen a lot of students where there's like this really great desire to teach them how to self-advocate, and we'll have like even have like a self-advocacy goal on the IEP, right? And it'll say like they're gonna, ask for assistance, 80% of the time on this type of task or whatever it is. And it's a great goal, but it's not the first goal. I think a lot of times we're expecting a student to self-advocate before they even know what they're supposed to be advocating for, right? So if you don't have good self-monitoring skills, you're not even going to know that you should be asking for help, right? Because you don't even realize that you went wrong, right? So if you can't see the problem, how are you going to know to ask for help? And maybe if you see the problem, you may not know what the possible types of solutions might be, right? So I think that a lot of times we forget to think about some of these other domains before placing the demand of self-advocacy on there. So I like to throw it up there, even though it's like technically not in and of itself a metacognitive skill, but there's a lot of metacognitive skills you have to have in order to be a self-advocate. Behavioral regulation is a little bit more simplified up here, but it's attention, focus, arousal, not being overly tired, not being overly hyper, the ability to sort of manage your impulses and the way that you respond to situations, and your overall emotional regulation as well. When we define executive function in this way, you can really see that where that toxic triad comes from, because in defining executive function, we literally have attention and emotional control. So, these are skills, they live in the same areas of the brain, they're highly interconnected, there's no way to separate them out because there's such significant overlap, not just in the locations of the brain, but in the way that we're actually defining the terms themselves. So what does it mean? Like, what are some of the things that we have to do that place demands on executive function? Well, at school, it could be making transitions between subjects or classes, which transitioning in and of itself actually has several executive function demands within transition, because there's terminating, knowing what the next thing is, and then initiating what the next thing is. But you have to organize your materials, your desk, or your binder. You have to get started. You have to know what the directions are. Stamina, attention, you recognize when you're making errors, prevent them, fix them, ask for help, stay seated, manage your emotions. I mean, literally all day, every day in school, like tons of executive function demands, right? Now, obviously, in a developmentally appropriate way. So we're not necessarily asking like a kindergartner to do all of these things, right? We hopefully are gradually increasing the demands that we're placing over time, but even still, there's still a lot of executive function stuff that you have to do at a very young age. It's just at a developmentally lower level. So for somebody who has a hard time with that, who has a hard time sustaining focus or not getting up out of their seat every 30 seconds, it's a lot to manage. And then the problem is that you do that for 6 hours, you get out of school, and then you go home. And guess what? You have to do it again. It's just different types of tasks. So at home, you, in theory, are supposed to maintain a clean room that doesn't have all the laundry on the floor next to the hamper, like at my house. Get ready for school, get out the door in the morning, being able to do homework, knowing when to do it, how to do it, play, social interactions, tons of executive function demands within those, right? So getting out of the house on time, keeping your body in control, don't punch your sibling because they took your favorite toy. Literally all day, every day, executive function is a big thing. So when we have a kid who has challenges in any one of these domains of executive function, now it's most typical that somebody has, if you were to have executive function challenges, it's likely not in all domains. It's not like an all or nothing thing. It's probably in some domains. And we have to figure out which ones are stronger so we can use them to compensate for the ones that might be more challenged. But you literally don't get a break away from executive function. And then the cumulative impact that might have on an individual who is inclined towards being stressed, it can be really difficult. So I've stressed you out about anxiety, and now I've stressed you out further about all the executive function demands we have in life. So attention. So if you have it left in you to think about attention and pay attention to it, attentional control is probably a little more straightforward. Choosing what you pay attention to in the moment and what you don't pay attention to. We all have tons of sensory input at all points of every second of every day. So right now I can hear there's a buzzing sound coming from this general area, right? I've noticed it since I got here, but I'm not really paying attention to it. It's not important to this situation right now. Now that I've mentioned it, you probably all have noticed it as well and will be distracted for the rest of the evening. But we know what to not pay attention to, right? We can filter it away. Some people can't do that. They hear the buzzing and that's all they can think about because it's driving them nuts, right? And it pulls their attention away from what they're supposed to be thinking about. So ignoring distractors, maintaining focus and concentration, and being able to, again, shift the attention from what we're maybe currently thinking about to what we need to be thinking about next. One thing I like to emphasize is that somebody who has difficulties with attention, it's not that they can't pay attention, it's just that they kind of do it like inconsistently, right? So sometimes when we see kids for evaluations, I'll say to a parent like, well, their scores are wildly inconsistent. Sometimes they do great and sometimes they do poorly on a very similar type of task and they're just all over the place. And they're like, oh, so it's like all invalid. I'm like, no, it's actually very clear. Like their pattern is that they are consistently inconsistent. And we know that sometimes they can do really good and sometimes they can do really bad. And we need to think about the conditions under which they do really well so that we can teach them how to do that way when they aren't doing well, right? Like you have to try to find a pattern within this seeming lack of pattern in performance. And so we have these expected patterns of inconsistencies in individuals with attentional challenges. And whether or not somebody has attentional problems is not defined by their ability to or inability to pay attention. It's more about the consistency with which they do it, right? So perhaps sometimes a child can direct their focus super efficiently, and they're right there with you. And then sometimes it takes them, a good 5-10 seconds, minutes, I don't know, in order to bring it there. And it's hard because we can see these kids doing it really well sometimes and really not well other times, it starts to feel more choicey, like they're choosing to pay attention sometimes and not at other times. And so they are really at risk for looking like a behavior problem. But it's not that simple because the child themselves probably can't even anticipate the times when they're going to be able to direct their focus quickly and the times when they're not. So it's frustrating for them as well. But from it sort of an outside perspective, it's really frustrating because it's like, I know you can do this. I've seen you do this like a million times, right? So But this really, there's a lot of research to show that this is really what attentional problems are about. It's not necessarily about the complete absence of ability to attend and focus, but it's really, what's more important is the consistency with which the child or adult does it. And, you know, I hear this all the time when I'm talking to parents about attention. And I'll be like, you know, one thing that's really came up is like a lot of challenges with attention. Like, no way. Like at home, they focus on this for a long time. Or and it's not necessarily a video game. It can be anything, right? It can be at Boy Scouts. They're right there all the time. They're doing these complex projects with good planning and good attention and good focus or whatever. But, you know, what I'll have to say is, right, those are like preferred things, right? And again, this is where we start to think that kids are making choices, right? Because when they want to do something, they can pay attention, right? So then we think that when they're not paying attention, it's just because they don't want to do it. But we all know about the toxic triad, right? And so we all know that when that emotional regulation part of it is not well managed or positively activated, then your executive function and your attentional skills kind of go through the toilet, right? So if you're bored by something and just not interested, you're not only not interested, but the parts of your brain that are going to allow you to do the task and focus on it and make a plan for it, they're literally not activated from a neurological level. Now, for some of us, that's fine. Like, we can deal with it, right? Because some of us have better ability to manage boredom and push through it. But emotional control is not just about dealing with these really strong, unwanted emotions like fear and stress and anxiety and anger. It's also about regulating kind of the like laws, right? So if you're bored by something, you need to be able to regulate that and kind of access your other skills in spite of it. So somebody who has problems with the triad, if it's not a preferred task, they're not necessarily just choosing to not do it because they don't like it. It's not that that doesn't happen. But we are all more positively activated and more available to thinking and learning when we like something, right? So, but that is more important for some kids than others, right? So for kids who have more pronounced challenges in those domains, it's going to have a more significant impact than for those who don't. But this is all the type of stuff that starts to get me on my whole pedestal about choice and motivation and things like that and learning. Okay, I already talked about emotional control, but I think I probably just sort of talked about it even a bit further outside of stress and anxiety. But you know, it's not just about those emotional states. It's our ability to monitor sensations and thoughts and sort of internal experiences of really most any kind. It's not just being able to label it, but being able to sort of integrate language to it, being able to call it something and communicate it. So for somebody who has communication challenges, that presents a real challenge for their ability to demonstrate emotional control because they don't have those skills for being able to provide the labels and kind of contextualize it in the same way that somebody who has those language skills. And as I was saying, persisting in spite of challenge or boredom. So which starts to speak to the frustration and distress tolerance as well. So the thing is, the reason why I really like to talk about all of these three areas is not just because we need to know, okay, if somebody is stressed out, then they're going to have more likely to have problems with executive function and attention. That's absolutely true. But the other thing is that stress or anxiety may not always be observable, but some of the other things might be, right? So some people are really good at hiding their feelings, keeping them like under the surface, and not showing that they're stressed out about something or anxious about something. But that usually still occurs to some cost. So if we can't see the anxiety, we might see one of the other things that tends to be brought down by the anxiety, right? So if we're seeing a kid who's having a hard time focusing, be it in class or in the lunchroom, like where they're just sort of like spacing out, instead of chatting with their friends or whatever, or if they're having like, oh, they're just like forgetting everything everywhere all the time, or, those are the types of things that could also signal that there might be some stress or anxiety that are underlying, particularly if it's a change in the pattern, like their sort of typical pattern, perhaps. So it's an important sort of triad or interaction to understand when we're trying to be good detectives and trying to identify the kids who might be experiencing stress or anxiety, but not necessarily portraying it in this sort of stereotypical manner. So some things you might see instead are the forgetfulness or slow worker, trouble learning from mistakes, making that same mistake over and over. How many times do I have to tell you to do it differently? The distractibility, avoiding schoolwork, self-confidence, perfectionism, right? The getting stuck, overly stuck in things. The inconsistencies, social immaturity, perhaps of, again, having a hard time like picking up on all the right cues and putting them together. Hard time pulling thoughts together because there's just the interference of the stress or expressing thoughts. I mean, it could be a million other things, but this is stuff that it doesn't mean for sure it's stress or anxiety. It could be one of those other things, but these are the things that should sort of like perk our attention and have us start to look at some of the patterns in when these things are happening, or thinking about when did they start. How often are we seeing them? Is it around certain times of the day, the year, the month, the sort of school schedule, whatever? And most importantly, as I keep talking, just kind of alluding to, is they just might look unmotivated. Like they just don't care, right? And I've already said the word motivation, I called it's like a dirty M word. It's like a swear word to me because they just used wrong. Like it's used wrong all the time. And not for intention. People don't know that they're using it the wrong way. It's just sort of the way that we've created it as a construct is inaccurate. And it's a really misunderstood thing. Because we will, either say or hear things all the time, like, why doesn't he just do it? How many times do I have to ask you? I say that a lot at my house, so like, totally guilty. Why don't you care? Just doesn't have the drive. I mean, we could think of a million different things that we could say without necessarily saying, like, you just aren't motivated or you just don't care. But, like, that really is kind of what we're saying when we say those things. Because we're kind of showing our frustration in relation to the individual's inability to do a task in the way that we want them to. And the problem is that when we start to think about motivation as in this way, is that we're really starting to imply that effort is not happening because of a choice, right? Because the individual is just choosing to not do it, whereas they could make the choice to do it if they had wanted to. But the problem is that, like, let's see how many, I didn't know I animated this slide. Okay. It's when we start to talk about it like that, we're really, it feels like super blamey, like it's like your fault or like you're flawed in some way. Like it's your problem, right? It's not our problem. It's not because we're not providing you with the right amount of support, right? It's your problem. You're making the choice to do something. It's really placing the onus of responsibility entirely on the individual. Is that to say that the individual doesn't have any responsibility? Of course, they have tons of responsibility. But so does the system, right? Nobody lives in a vacuum. And when we start to think about motivation in this way, we completely ignore the system, right? It's not thinking about the other factors or the other underlying factors for the individual that are amounting to their seeming lack of motivation. And so the problem is that this, not helpful. Because if we are approaching it as blame or like lack of personal responsibility, that leaves us nothing to do. You can't fix a flaw in a personality, right? You can't fix that. So to view somebody as being just an unmotivated individual or a lazy person, it really leaves you with nothing to do. So let's not do that, right? A better way to look at it is to think about it as a function of executive function and all these other triad-related things that we've been talking about. And again, I don't think we intentionally try to place blame and make people feel bad, but it's just what happens. And again, I say this as a guilty party, right? It's what we inherently start to do. It's a natural reaction, but it's not helpful. So if we look at motivation as a complex executive function process that requires the synthesis of a wide variety of skills to kind of come together and be activated towards a goal, well, we can start to think about what is it that we're having to do this task? We have to think about what's the complexity of the task at hand. What are the things that the child is, what are the skills that are required? What is it they're having to not do when I'm asking them to do this? So a lot of times it's okay, yes, they know they need to do this, but there's this other thing that seems way more interesting, and it's not hard, so they're having to also inhibit, not just execute. Oh, my picture's too far to the left. But the reality is that there's very few individuals, and I would argue there's none. Nobody's born unmotivated. Maybe there's a rare person who happens to have a tumor in the wrong area of the brain or something. I don't know. But that's not the people we're talking about here today, right? Nobody is born unmotivated. We become unmotivated through persistent inability to do something, right? So think about that sort of third option reaction, right? That sort of freeze response. Lack of motivation is kind of a freeze, right? You're frozen in the moment of not doing the thing that other people are wanting you to do, right? So it's not being presented to you in a way that you can access, or what you don't have the core skills, or whatever it is. It's placing some demand that you don't have the skills to manage, perhaps persistently over time, right? So if these people could do it, they would. Now, that doesn't mean that behavioral patterns don't develop over time, and that there becomes a point where you're presenting the person with the right amount of support, and you now know, you saw the light, and you figured out the profile, and now you're giving them all the supports they could possibly need, and they still don't want to do it. Okay, well, yeah, because we're trying to reverse sort of this trained pattern. So it's not that you're not going to also be up against this sort of behavioral piece that comes into play, but we have to try to kind of work backwards and support it from the ground up, realizing that it's a matter of ensuring that they have the skills that are necessary. There's a lot of research to support this. I'll give you one example. So there was, back before we had ethics review boards, we did some really great experiments that we learned a lot from, but would never be able to do nowadays. And so there was this one lovely experiment conducted by Seligman, and this was, a good, 50 years ago or so, where they had these cages, and the dog, I feel like it looks like a rabbit in this picture, but it's a dog. Fine still. It's on one side, and the floor is electrified. And initially, there's no hole there. They're stuck on that one side. But there's a little pedal thing. And so the electrical current starts and the thing's getting shocked. But when it presses the pedal, the current stops, and it stops getting shocked. So the idea is that we're teaching the dog to learn to press the pedal to stop the electrical current. Okay. Well, now there's also a second cage with a dog, same setup, electrical current, no escape door. That dog doesn't have a pedal. Whether or not that dog's electrocution stops depends on whether that dog stops its electrical current. So it stops it in both cages. Now, unfortunately, dog B does not know, well, they're probably not smart enough to make the conclusion anyway, but they don't know what's stopping it when it stops. They just know that sometimes it stops fast and sometimes it stops slow, and it's really unpredictable. So what happens is you do this like over and over and over again. You have one dog that's learning to press the pedal. You have the other dog that has this incredibly unpredictable pattern of when the electrical current stops and starts. And then you lift up the little thing that's blocking the door in between, and you do the same thing. So you start the electrical current. Both dogs have an access to a door and a way to get out. The dog who used the pedal immediately jumps out. The dog who had no ability to have control over their situation lays down and takes it no matter what and never escapes. Consistently, every dog over time. There's a way out, and they don't take it. They lay there and they get shocked every time. Because for so long, they were unable to manage the demand with no predictable pattern and no way of seeking help or the skills for knowing how to do that. You can see where I'm getting with this, right? So yes, we get behavioral patterns when we have a child who for so long has no control over the demands that they're being placed with, right? I mean, there's very little in life that children can actually control. Well, there's very little in life that any of us can actually control, although we can control more than children can. And for so long, if they're being presented with things that they can't manage, eventually, even once you have the ability to do so, they don't necessarily make that choice. Which is all the reason why it's really important to think about how to prevent that from the get-go. But then once these patterns start to happen, you also have to think about how to support sort of that emotional component of those repeated failures. Have I really made this a grim situation yet? Are you feeling really unmotivated about your ability to manage these things with your child? The good news is that this is stuff that we can totally prevent. So, what are some things that we can try to do to prevent these patterns from happening? Because a lot of this is focusing on sort of individuals, right? So an individual's profile or an individual's sort of sense of personal, their ability to take action and make choices. But there's a lot that we can do really at first from like a more systemic or preventative level before we ever get ourselves deep into that evil cycle that can sometimes happen for kids. So, the one thing that we want to attempt to always do is set kids up for success. I know that sounds obvious. But some of the basics here are, not overscheduling. So I know I talked a lot about that before, but it's a really big one because the impact that it has on sleep and helping to prioritize demands and all that stuff. There's so many things that come into play here. And that really is not just a matter of like parent choice of overscheduling. Yes, absolutely. However, there's also this like larger, more systemic issue of like how we're creating this need to overschedule. So it's like I said, with my 6-year-old who has baseball 3 times a week, and there's like literally no other option. So it's a systemic and an individual sort of challenge to find a way to avoid doing that to kids. Making sure that we're eating balanced and sleeping well. Like I said, most kids or everybody, not just kids, are getting about 2 hours a night of less sleep than is necessary. There is good research to show that you can make up for your sleep debt. So sleep debt is that sort of that loss of sleep. So every time we lose 2 hours, we're adding 2 hours to our sleep debt that we need to make up. So those kids who, on the weekends, they sleep until like 1 in the afternoon, sure, great, let them do it. Like they're making up their sleep debt. Like that's actually helpful and can pay off. But ideally, we're not creating the debt to begin with. There is, again, a lot of research to show that 60 minutes of physical exercise a day has not just benefits from a physical level, but self-regulation as well. So improving emotional regulation, reducing stress. There's definitely statistically significant findings there. Something else that I think that we can do as parents, teachers, systems, whatever, is helping to balance our goals. So with our extrinsically motivated society that we've now created, right, we're so focused on like what's the next thing, right? So like getting into college or getting onto the team or whatever it is. Those like big goals are really big and really far away. And there's really not much that you can do, like right here, today, right now, to guarantee that you're going to get into college a year or 2 years from now, right? Unless you're like Aunt Becky from Full House, right? Like, you can like pay off somebody, but the reality is there's nothing that the child can do to guarantee that you're going to get into college. I one time was doing an evaluation with this girl, and she's like 16. She wasn't even close to graduating yet, and tons of anxiety. And she was explaining, why she had the science test that she did really poorly on. She got like a B+. And so I was sort of asking her like how she felt about that, and she's like, well, because I did so poorly on that test, it means I'm going to get a really bad grade in that class. And if I get a bad grade in that class, I'm not going to have enough AP credits in order to get into the college that I want. If I don't get into the college I want, then I'm not going to be able to study this program. I'm not going to become like whatever this profession was. And if I'm not going to do that, then I'm probably going to like have no money. I'm going to have no profession. I'm going to live in a ditch. And like she literally went from like getting a B+ on a science test to living in a ditch in like 10 seconds. Like, I mean, that's just... But that's like what's going on all the time in these anxious individuals' minds, right? Is that they're looking at this like huge future goal of getting into college or whatever it is. But there's like literally nothing you can do right here, right now, today in order to achieve that. But we can help them balance those with things that we can achieve right here, right now, today. So if all of our goals are things that we cannot reach in the immediate future, we'd never have this feeling of success in reaching a goal. And goals always feel scary. So we need to help create the experience of having a goal that is sort of well-planned and measurable and attainable and then attained to have that positive experience of reaching something, right? So, thinking about what can we do this week, today, and really label it. Because there's a million things that we do every single day, but we don't necessarily label it as a goal. Well, start doing that, find ways to sort of reward yourself for achieving the things that seem mundane, and your children as well. But it's really helping them to see that they do have an ability to control their progress towards something, and that has a cumulative impact towards the long-term goals as well. But it really sort of helps to ground us, right? Remember, if we're thinking about anxiety, it's about thoughts about that are in the future or in the past, but not about the present. Like, we need to do something that grounds us in the present. Being consistent and having a good follow through with the things that we say that we're going to do, and is really important. So if we have kids who are anxious, anxiety is all about that fear of loss of control or unpredictability, that the world is going to move on in unpredictable patterns around them, and they're not going to be able to do anything to sort of take over any amount of control. And so if we are creating schedules or saying certain things are going to happen and then they don't, and we're just contributing to their sense that the world is unpredictable, and therefore anxiety-provoking, then that's not super helpful. We also have to teach some amount of flexibility eventually over time, but the idea is that we kind of meet the child where they are and then gradually increase the demand. So we don't teach flexibility by forcing them into an overly unpredictable schedule before they're ready to do that. We create as much sort of co-regulatory opportunities as we can. So I say all the time, kids who have anxiety, they're not able to regulate themselves, right? Their self-regulation skills have not yet developed. So we have to think about, okay, how do we usually teach self-regulation? Like a little tiny baby does not know how to self-regulate, right? So when they're born, they can't feed themselves, they can't do anything. All they can do is cry, right? So they cry. And then we go to them and we do what they need. We change them, we give them food, we give them comfort, we help them to co-regulate, right? They're regulating with the person who's caring for them and with the environment around them. And the idea is that over time, hopefully, they become increasingly able to do that on their own. So maybe they start to realize that their pacifier is right there, and they can pick it up and put it in their mouth. And then they have a favorite lovey, and then they start to learn other skills. But that hopefully, by the time they're teenagers, they don't need us every single time. They have to regulate. They have some skills to do that. But sometimes individuals who are experiencing anxiety, they have not yet benefited from a true co-regulating experience. Not necessarily at the fault of the environment or the people around them, but perhaps because their anxiety has just overridden their ability to be available to it at one point. So we have to think about how do we recreate those experiences of regulating with their system and with their people, right? And I think that this is something that is easier to achieve in school than home, because school's just naturally more structured and predictable, and it's hard to do that at home. It just is. But it's something that we can do, and the idea is sort of helping that to become more and more shifting those responsibilities onto the child. But we start that by having this follow through and consistency and those co-regulatory experiences. And I'll talk about some other ways that we do that. And then use this triad in their favor. So I know I call it the toxic triad, but the reality is it doesn't have to be toxic. It can be good, right? So if we can teach information through personally desirable topics or fun hands-on experiences, we are positively activating that emotional regulation arm of the triad, which is going to open up sort of the full range of skills within the attention and the executive function ones, right? Or if we know we have a child who's got anxiety or or bored or whatever, there's something that's sort of an emotional barrier within that arm of the triad, then maybe we add in some extra executive function supports that we know in theory they don't really need, but it helps to create more structure and consistency and predictability and sense of achievement within the task that's then going to create the positive emotional experience, right? So there's ways that we can kind of think about how to flip this sort of triad idea to being a more positive and useful tool than always sort of going against us. So one way that we do that sort of with the emotional realm and a way to create these sort of co-regulatory experiences is by creating an environment of awareness and acceptance. So what does that mean? Well, we want to talk about feelings. I know that we don't necessarily always intentionally not talk about feelings, but we also don't necessarily talk about them in the way that is helpful, particularly for kids who need to have that explicitly taught. Any skill that we are supposed to develop should be explicitly taught. And we're really good at explicitly teaching reading and writing and math, and even social skills sometimes, but we sometimes forget to explicitly teach emotions, like emotion labeling and identification and regulation. So a great way to do that is to, talk about them, model it. So when you're having an emotional experience in a well-regulated manner, talk about it. Don't fly off the handle. But, just label normal, everyday emotional experiences that we're having. So when we are running late to school and, we're feeling frustrated or whatever, it's okay to say, I'm feeling a little frustrated right now because we're running late for school, right? And sort of explaining, what the trigger was for that or the experience that you're having, but communicating it in a regulated manner that models communication. And ideally, then the problem-solving part, hey, what's something we can do to help the situation, right? So just finding those everyday opportunities to talk about our, not just unwanted feelings, but the positive ones as well. So labeling, oh, I was so excited today. I got a new pair of shoes. It was awesome. So that, which is great. That's, showing that it's okay to have emotion words in our conversations. I know we don't intentionally dismiss emotions, but we do it all the time. especially with young children. So, for example, if we have a child who has a spelling test and they're really worried about it. They've never really had a hard time on spelling tests before, but they're really worried about this one for whatever reason. Something we might say to them is like, don't worry about it. Like, you always do fine. There's no reason to be worried. Sounds like an appropriate response, right? It's not, though. Like, what did we do? We, like, completely invalidated their feelings and basically said, like, don't tell me how you're feeling because it's completely invalid, so don't bother telling me next time you feel that way because it's wrong. Right? I mean, that's kind of like the subtext of when we say those things. And we don't mean to. Like, we're trying to be nice, helpful caregivers and encouraging and boost that self-esteem. But the reality is that they're in that moment, they're telling us that they're worried. And we need to have a reaction that shows that we're recognizing, not trying to say whether it's right or wrong, but just validating their emotional experience. So an easy way to change that would be like, I hear that you're really worried about your spelling test. What's something that we can do to help you feel a little bit more confident? Right? There you go. Or like, what's something that we can do to help you prepare? Like, acknowledge the feeling and move towards problem solving, right? And so there's no need to say whether or not it's valid or invalid. It just is what it is. Like, perception is reality. And so I think that there's a lot of times when we can find those like in teeny tiny opportunities where we are accidentally dismissing emotions. And I do this all the time. Again, guilty as charged, particularly with our young kids. I find myself doing this all the time with my almost 3-year-old, and I like have to try to then shift and say it a different way. But it's the natural reaction of like, no need to be upset, or like, but it's not necessarily, particularly for kids who have a hard time with emotion regulation, it's not necessarily useful. And it's not useful to lose it either. So like, we should try, guilty, to have appropriate emotional management. And we're not going to always, again, but when we don't, acknowledge it, right? Admit fault, and show that it's okay that we make those mistakes and that we're not always perfect, and that we can like learn from those incidences. So particularly when we're talking about kids who have triad problems, shall we say, difficulties with anxiety, we have to keep in mind that these are kids who get a really high rate of negative and corrective feedback. Again, not always meant to be bad, but corrective. So particularly if it's sort of lending towards impulsivity, inattention, we redirect, right? We sort of give them the prompts like, oh, we're not doing that right now, we're doing this. Or, oh, remember you're supposed to do that. Like, again, we're meaning to be helpful, but it's a lot of feedback. It's a lot of correction. We just had on our Facebook, our feed this just today or yesterday, I forget what it was. I think it said, by the age of 12, an individual with attention deficit gets 20,000 more like negative comments like directed to them than individuals without attentional problems, something like that. That's sort of what we're talking about. And they need it, like they need that redirection support. But we have to keep in mind, like, how often are we giving it? How are we terming it? And are we balancing it with the positive, right? So these are individuals who we need to really focus on creating a balance because they do need more assistance perhaps, but we can't have it be overly weighted in a way that feels low self-esteem. So they really need that sort of positivity. Like I've always said, their perception is the reality, and we have to meet them where they are. We also have to keep in mind, when I was a kid, I loved whack-a-mole at Canby Lake. It was like my favorite game ever, and I won this like massive panda bear one year with it. And I never knew that would come in handy later in life when I was an anxiety expert. But there is this whack-a-mole effect that happens with anxiety, is that, we come up with this great plan, like this awesome plan for how we're going to target this individual's like maybe we'll stick with spelling tests, spelling test anxiety. And we become emotionally aware, and we help them learn the skills, and we boost confidence, and they get it. They are now super confident when it comes to spelling tests, and they're good to go. And then all of a sudden math tests are a nightmare, or it moves somewhere, right? So as soon as one of those moles goes down, another one pops up, or maybe it's anxiety about the bus or whatever. Anxiety doesn't give up easily. Right, it's going to kind of keep testing to see, do you actually have control? Do you actually have the ability to, make decisions and manage yourself and manage the situation? So it's going to pop up somewhere else. But what's really important to keep in mind is that is a good thing. Right, it's good when the anxiety pops up again in another way or in another manner, because that shows us that we're winning and the anxiety is not. Right? It's because the anxiety is kind of saying, okay, you think you got it there, but are you going to be able to do it here too? So now we have to support and teach in that other domain. What happens a lot of times, so back in the day when I still did therapy, I would say to parents, so listen, we're going to do this really directive therapeutic intervention where we're purposely placing the child in the presence of their triggers, and it's going to be super hard, and they're going to freak out, and you're going to freak out, and we're all going to freak out, but we're going to make it through, right? And at the end of the day, we won't be freaking out anymore because we've worked through our hierarchy of fears. And we've learned that even though the anxiety pops up, if we sit with it long enough, it's going to go away. And we don't need to escape if we just sit with it. And we're going to be good to go. But here's the key. So I say, around session 4, your child's really going to freak out and refuse to come and dig the heels, and you're going to have to drag them in the car. Drag them in. Get them in here. No matter what, do not quit. Because the anxiety is going to escalate right when you're approaching a breakthrough, right? And what often happens is when that other mole pops up or that anxiety escalates, when the anxiety shifts, that is the time when we see the most, I'm bowing out, right? The most escape therapeutically within simple interventions day to day. And the promise is that reinforces the anxiety to occur at a level that's actually higher than it ever was once before. Because it shows that you can't handle this. So you have to know that there's this whack-a-mole effect that's probably going to pop up somewhere else, that it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that it's a therapeutically good thing. Because if you stick with it and you push through, all of a sudden you'll see this drastic sort of decline on the other side. But it's really important to know that because a lot of times people will be like, okay, we were progressing, then all of a sudden it got so much worse. And then people get frustrated with the plan, and then they stop doing it. And that frustration is just an indication that it might actually just be working. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Okay, what else can we do? Well, we can try to find these things early on. So one reason why we talk so much about the different ways that anxiety can present and the associated sort of brain-based functions and so those sort of hidden signs of anxiety is because, we have to be aware of these different ways that the anxious arousal can come forth so that we don't accidentally miss the kid who just seems like they're inattentive. Maybe they do just have attention problems. It's entirely possible. But it's also possible that it might be something else. Recognizing the patterns and then being the detective. And keeping these things in mind. There's not kids who are intrinsically unmotivated. If they could do it, they would. And we have to figure out what is the point where they're struggling. That's entirely repetitive to what I just said. So, sometimes that's easy, and sometimes it's not. Because some of these things are brain-based functions, and how do you filter just by doing a behavioral observation of what's actually going on under the surface? This is where we look at it from sort of a testing perspective. Sometimes it might be done from sort of an educational standpoint, so a psychoeducational evaluation can reveal if there is academic problems or if there's working memory or processing issues or things like that. And this is sort of what from the neuropsychological review, we look at a lot of those same things, but then just sort of reaching into other developmental domains as well. And the idea is that we are looking across history and observations and testing and trying to really elucidate what is that pattern in performance or in skill set that might be contributing to the why the child's presenting in this way, and then what we can do about it. Because yes, it could be one of those triad things, but like it could also be any of these other things as well. And it's tricky because sometimes we might think that we know what it was, but we miss a piece, and there's only so much effectiveness that our interventions are going to have. And so if a child has academic anxiety and we are treating the anxiety but missing a learning disability, you're not going to get very far in your intervention because they still have a learning disability at the end of the day, right? So again, if we're thinking about that child who has those repeated experiences of failure, well, we have to think about what the failure experiences are so that we can make them not failure experiences. So we just try to spell it out and figure out, like, sometimes it's just this triad, but this triad co-occurs oftentimes with a host of other possibilities, learning issues, developmental issues, things like that. So we really have to make sure we understand all aspects of it so that our interventions are effective. And then what can we do to help? I mean, I've already sort of said, executive function strategies, because of the association of the triad, can be used as good anxiety management strategies, right? So, a lot of times we might think, well, I'm a teacher, like, what can I do? I'm not a therapist, like, I can't do like an anxiety intervention in the classroom, but what we can do is create sort of the structures and predictability and things that we would do for executive function to sort of support that arm of the triad, because it's going to have a trickle-down effect on the emotional one, right? So there is a lot that we can do, and that's not just at school, at home too. Like creating predictability and schedules and checklists in those times when anxiety maybe tends to pop up the most. And the idea is that we're trying to teach skills that and routines that will internalize over time, right? So hopefully a child's not going to go off to college with a checklist for how to get ready in the morning, right? Like, hopefully they figured that out along the way, but maybe they needed it earlier on, right? So perhaps you start with that checklist, and then you try to and it's like super specific of every single little step. So it's not just like, prepare your backpack. It's backpack, folder, lunchbox, water bottle, like every single thing. But then you maybe remove the specificity over time, right? So then it just does say prepare your backpack. Hopefully now that they know what that means, what's included in that, right? So you sort of titrate off of the schedule and the routine. Manageable challenges. So not, going too big with the things that we're asking kids to do. Ideally, your first goal for a child should be what they're currently functioning at. That's not a good sentence. So like if they are able to sort of already they can get ready for school, if you tell them like very specifically, I need you to get dressed, go put on your socks and your underwear and your pants and your shirt, and they can handle that. Your first checklist should say, get dressed, socks, underwear, pants, shirt, right? Because then they can have a success experience, right? They can do it and feel the confidence of having that sort of success experience as opposed to a failure experience. And then you up the demand, right? But we should always start our plans with the skill that they're currently at. Not one step ahead, not two, like literally where they are. Because what's most important in any intervention or plan is the child feeling confident about their ability to do it, not by placing demands too quickly. And then ideally coordinating these interventions as much as possible across settings. Kids with executive function challenges are not good generalizers. So that means that they're not very good at learning something here and then remembering to do it there, right? So often the skill needs to be directly and explicitly taught and supported across settings. So in every class, or ideally, especially for these anxious kids, having the same sort of plan at home and at school. So if there's sort of like a general type of a visual schedule that's used at school, like use the same type at home, but with like home type tasks on it, or if there's emotional vocabulary that you're using, making sure that all the adults know it. Having the same approach across all environments is just going to allow for quicker acquisition of the skills. This is like super quick. I mean, there's a billion things that we can do to create these structures and predictability and co-regulatory experiences in school. But these are some very like basic sort of supports that we might see for individuals with executive function or triad related challenges. The idea here is that we're generally just providing more repetition, more practice, sort of solidifying the skills, aiding with that generalization, and sort of supporting that the emotional arm. So creating those more positive experiences, like pairing with a preferred partner, if it's a task that's going to be less preferred. So again, this is like a very small number of items as examples, and which supports are appropriate for a child is going to be entirely dependent on who they are as an individual. And so it's really important to make sure that each support is well thought through as it relates to that child's profile. So related, when you're thinking about what's best for a child, take some things into consideration. Like, so what's the age and the developmental level? So like not placing the demand too high. Keeping in mind the learning profile. So if you've got a child who has a language or communication disorder, you don't want to use a very language-heavy intervention where you're talking through everything, right? Like you might want to use a more visually based system, right? So you have to kind of keep that stuff in mind. Making sure that we sort of give a direct approach to the stress response. So what that means is it's that physiological reaction of anxiety that the body just naturally kind of gets when activated. So finding some sort of self-calming, and whether it's mindfulness or sort of yoga-based intervention, whatever it is, finding some way to sort of help them learn how to just calm their overall arousal. And the reason why that's really important is because those types of skills are not only going to benefit your stress response, but the same thing can be used to improve your attentional regulation or sort of regulation across multiple domains. Making sure, like we said before, teaching any skills that are lacking. So if there's like a learning issue, make sure you're addressing the learning issue. And, because these kids don't generalize, you can't expect everything to be fixed just in school. You can't expect everything to be fixed just at home. It has to be a well thought out collaboration. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's like a huge ordeal. Like sometimes this stuff is incredibly simple stuff, but we just have to think about the way that we're doing it. It's not even necessarily anything that's going to take extra time. It just takes a little bit of thought in planning. I'll very briefly touch on what are some of the types of therapy services that we see kids do with anxiety. Again, we can do a very long presentation just on this topic alone, but I'll at least touch on some of the sort of main things, particularly as related to the triad. So cognitive behavioral therapy is sort of the treatment of choice for anxiety, depression, things like that. And it has a lot of research backing, and it really focuses on teaching how to recognize those internal experiences and the thought patterns that are associated with anxiety, and noticing the thoughts as they come up and whether they're useful thoughts, and adapting the thoughts if they're not useful, and sort of changing your behavioral patterns so that you're activating positive experiences and all this sort of stuff. And it's great. It's wonderful. It's highly effective. Been there, done that. Love it. Okay. But there's a problem with this type of intervention for kids with triad issues. So this type of intervention places a lot of demands on executive function. The cognitive component alone requires that you know how to do internal thought monitoring, recognition of the thought, communication of it, and then flexibly adapting it. So being able to critically analyze whether it's helpful or not helpful, and then change the thought based on your determination. That's called metacognition. And so for a child who has executive function weaknesses and problems with metacognition, it can create a barrier to their ability to do cognitive behavioral therapy. Not always. It's not like a all or nothing type of thing where if you have a kid with executive function problems, don't take them to their CBT tomorrow. I'm not saying that. But if you have a child who's not making progress in treatment, and these are the kids who are often showing, like, presenting for evaluations with us. We've been in cognitive behavioral therapy with this, like, great therapist for 2 years, and, like, we're not getting anywhere, and we don't know why. Sometimes it's in the learning profile. Sometimes there's something about the executive function or the language or something that's not appropriate for this child at hand. And so we have to sort of think about what we're doing within our interventions. Even if it's the gold standard, it may not be the gold standard for this person, right? There are ways to adapt interventions around that. So sometimes it's just a matter of working with a clinician who understands profiles, learning profiles, or sometimes it's doing a different type of treatment. There's other forms of cognitive behavioral therapy that place fewer demands on executive function and metacognition. Mindfulness is one, and particularly acceptance and commitment therapy, which is sort of like a new wave cognitive behavioral intervention. And to really, really oversimplify what it is, instead of changing thought patterns, it focuses on awareness and acceptance. So instead of thinking, okay, I'm going to fail this test, and then thinking, okay, have I ever failed the test before? If I've never failed the test before, is this thought that I'm going to fail the test going to be helpful for me? It's not helpful for me, so how am I going to change my thought? You don't do any of that. You recognize the thought of, like, oh my God, I'm going to fail my test. Okay, is that a helpful thought? No, not really. Okay, let's move on. Like, you just acknowledge it. You accept it. Like, you're welcoming it to the party. You're saying, like, hi, anxious thought about failing the test. Welcome to the party. Let's sit right here. I have no problem with you. But then you kind of move on from it. It really focuses on values and goals-driven sort of stuff, but it's highly effective, again, research-based, intervention. But from my perspective, yes, I love it because my dissertation was based in it, blah, blah, blah. But it places way fewer demands on executive function, and kids will often make a lot of progress, not even having to significantly adapt treatment, but just integrating some of these approaches and reducing some of the cognitive demands that are inherent in the standard treatment. Other things you can do with the treatment, just reducing language, using more multisensory approaches. So instead of talking about what it feels like inside your body when you're anxious, roll a paper, lay on the floor, trace your body, and draw it, right? So finding those multisensory ways of doing it. Using strength and interest. Basically, when we have a kid who's on an IEP and is in therapy and they're not making progress, the simplest way to think about it is I say to the parent, listen, open up their IEP and go to their accommodations page. Do all of that in treatment. Treatment is learning. It's just learning different things. So if they need repetition, previewing, multisensory instruction, whatever, to learn in school, then they need it to learn in therapy. So they may need to go to therapy 2 to 3 times a week, not once a week. Right? They may need to have integration of visual supports. Right? So when in doubt, consult your IEP. Because there's a lot of really good information. And we don't intuitively share our IEPs with therapists because it seems discrepant, because we've been trained that, like, the medical system and the educational system, they can't work together, thanks to managed care. But it's not true. And there's a lot of really good information in an IEP that can help a clinician to tailor their treatment for your child. Here's some, like, incredibly basic but really helpful books that talk about some of the stuff that we're discussing. I think the key here is that we said before, kids don't exist in a vacuum, and so you can't expect just the child to change what they're doing. So we have to, as a system, change. And so particularly for our young kids, there can be just as much effectiveness through solely parent-focused training as there can be for individually. This top book is it's not a clinical book at all, but it's a really great book for just learning some basic ways of encouraging this emotional awareness and not accidentally being dismissive. There's a teen version and a kid version. This is the kid one. And this bottom one is a little bit more of a specific parenting book about how to parent anxiety. And again, through that lens of acceptance and commitment approaches. And then there's other ways of doing things Like, we don't have to all just sit in an office and talk about stuff. Sometimes that's great. But sometimes it's not enough. Maybe it has to happen alongside something else that targets the physiological, or sometimes we just need to try something different. So there's increasing amounts of research to support yoga-based and body-based interventions. Acupuncture as well. One thing that's nice about acupuncture, I'll have a lot of parents be like, well, I don't want to medicate my child, like there's something else to do. Well, some individuals respond really well to acupuncture. Some don't at all. But you usually know within like 4 to 5 like treatments. So it's kind of an easy thing to try. And if you're working with a good acupuncturist, they can help you to know pretty soon on whether or not something that might be helpful for the child. So sometimes they're like, not going to hurt to try. Same thing with, there's a lot of, I'm becoming increasingly fond of the idea of equine, therapy, particularly for these kids who have internal difficulties with sort of internal monitoring, sort of monitoring through an animal. They connect with it so much better. Obviously, there's psychopharmacology. But the reality is that all of these, particularly psychopharmacology, are going to work best in conjunction with skills-focused therapy. Research shows very clearly that skills are what is important. And if we forget to add that into the plan, there's sort of like a limit to what we might expect for the child to achieve. Okay, that was a lot of information. So I think that's the point where we cut off.
So first of all, thank you to Dr. Angela Currie for that presentation. It was a great presentation. And at this time, what I'm going to ask is that we end the broadcasting and we're going to open it up to questions. So we'll just give a minute. Like, feel free to stand up, stretch, do whatever.